Hi there.
How's
wait, you're back in your normal place.
Yes. We have a bunch of like family stuff going on. So can't be there in person on Friday. So Rhonda's going to do, well, she's the only in-person presenter. Arturo's not going to be able to be in person either. So we'll make it work. We're here.
Okay. Sounds good. Sounds good. How's everything going?
It's going. Summer is like crazy going fast and I'm not ready.
Oh, trust me, I'm not ready at all. It is shit. Yeah. There's a lot happening here. Anyway, I just learned more things. So I'm like, anyway.
Oh gosh.
Yep. It's intense.
Yeah.
So, yep. It's crazy. So anyway, but I thought the other day went really well.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Yes. Lots of things to think about.
Oh my gosh. I know. I think, I listen to that and I think I'd be so interested in that. I just don't know who my community is. Like, not like for my kind of work, I'm not sure who's the community, but I'm gonna think about that, like, the community, I guess, could be like, it's not a real community in the same sense, but like teachers could be the community in some sense. But but definitely it's not the same as like being out in the community. Like we've done some community outreach stuff, which has been really fun. My husband started that and like I've tagged along. We've done like farmers market stands and like a bunch of community events here. And it's been, Pittsburgh is very oddly like super segregated and it's very frustrating. But anyway, we live like the town we live in is it is more racially diverse, but like it is also segregated within itself. It's very odd. But so we went to like our farmers market and to get folks from a more representative sample, of participants and like another neighboring town to where we live. And he does like blood pressures and because he does like health related stuff. So he'll do people's blood pressures and give them a little report. And then he has the flyer about his study and my study and, so he's also providing like a service and stuff. So
yeah. I think that helps when it's also more concrete, like what you can give back. I think that's always hard to like think about, like,
exactly.
Why do you want? What do you want from me? What can I do for you? Kind of type.
Exactly. Yeah. They let him go wherever because he's like, well, I'll do blood pressures, and they're like, yeah, sure. People need that, Right. So yeah, and he can help interpret, and stuff. So, but it is. That's sometimes scary though, because sometimes people have like a really high blood pressure, and he's like, you really need to go do something about it, and some people don't want to, and he's like kind of freaked out by that. So, yeah, that's sometimes the downside of doing this kind of work. But anyway, not a lot you can do about it. Right. He also finds like tumors in people's brains when he scans their brains and has to call them. It's not me either. So
no, right? Yeah,
you want to do that work, that's part of your job.
Yep. Yeah, you have to have those policies or protocols in place. Like, what do you do if this thing happens?
Totally. Like one person knew already.
Yes.
He was like, maybe you probably should have told us.
Yes, right. There's that too. Non-disclosure.
Anyway, but yeah, I don't know. But yeah, that's been really nice. But it's not really the same as like involving people, right? So yeah, but that was great. I'm really glad.
And I liked Teresa's idea of maybe doing like a journal club or something through Spark.
Sure.
I think that could be on this topic or other topics, maybe just to the governing board about some way to like connect outside of conferences.
Yeah, so we had talked about doing that like a coffee hour kind of thing about like trauma, I think, or no, a follow-up on our previous one, right?
Webinar,
Yeah. So I think I was like, what was that thing called? Right, webinar. So yeah, I think we could do something like that too.
Yeah.
For any of these, yeah, that would be kind of fun. So hey, Arturo.
I was just freaked out because of this underlying thing, and I'm like, where am I gonna?
I know.
I just ended up in Zoom, so I'm like, okay, this is just another way to get to Zoom. But I'm like, oh no.
I know. I was like, is it really just like, can't you just like give me the link and then?
Right.
But
yeah,
they probably couldn't charge as much money if that's all they were going to do.
Right.
Yeah.
I had a quick question. Is this gonna be? So are we gonna be in a room? Are there people in a room? But this is kind of streamed in, but there'll people anyway. Okay.
Yep. So there is a physical room, and essentially the way it worked on Wednesday was that the room was just like another Zoom box, and so
Okay.
the people in the room can get up and ask questions, and they kind of try to turn the camera to them asking the question so you can see who that is on Zoom.
Okay.
But yeah, in the room we can't see faces, so that we can only see slides. So there's that. If you're curious, but
Okay. Got it.
hello.
Yeah.
How are you?
Good, thank you. How you doing?
Good. Is this at a somewhat decent time in Germany?
Yeah, it's 4:20 p.m. It's
good. I always worry about the time zone things with the internet.
No, I would have probably mentioned it if it would have been at a different time. Yeah. No, this is great.
Do you want to quick share your slides just to make sure that that's working?
I can do that, but after 2 years, I hope it does. Yeah. Right. You should be able to see something.
Show me commands.
That works?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. I might try another thing, which is this. No.
You went away.
I clicked the wrong thing. Okay, I think this is not so good because I'll have a small audience here, but probably they can see me on the screen. I'll keep it like this for my talk. Do we have an order?
Yes. So it'll be Jeni, Ronda, and then you, and then Arturo.
Okay, great.
I'm just going with whatever I wrote in the paper thing. That we.
Thank you.
And I'm surprised we don't have our like in-room Zoom box on here yet. So hopefully Ronda is okay there.
And based on Wednesdays, how many people were there live and how many people were online?
Yeah, so in person, there's between 25 and 30 at any given point, especially during the first half when we had the speakers. And then on, I think the one time I looked, it was like 26 or something, but I wasn't keeping good track of the online.
Me too. It was about, I think, 11 in the second half. And in the first half, that's also what I saw. It started out at about like 23 and then grew to about 26. So
yeah, I was all ready to go in person, and then I got COVID, and then I got freaked out from the random testing thing. I mean, it was 2 weeks ago, so I'm fine. I feel much better now. More than 2 weeks ago, but I'm just, they have random testing. I want to get stuck in Canada for 10 days. I'm fine. I'm not infectious, but the doctor told me, I went on Wednesday and he's like, no, you're fine. Don't worry. But if you travel right now, you're probably going to test positive, and that's just not good.
That's the thing. You keep testing positive for a long time, I think, after. Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
How are you doing, Jeni?
I'm okay. Yeah. I'm excited for our symposium.
Yes.
Is everyone enjoying the conference?
Yes. Although I have to admit that I have not been able to go too much because I've had there's a lot going on here. So it's not really happening.
Yeah, that's the hard part of doing virtual conferences. It's worse than a conference when you're at home and, when it's in your home city, that's already bad. This is just...
Well, what happened for me is that they didn't really post the specifics of the program as early. At least I couldn't find it very early. And so I didn't get like specific things on my calendar And then there was just like this big like cog sci. And that meant I wasn't able to block out certain things. And I run an internship program. This is their last few days. Oh. So we also had events associated with that. So it's those were already booked before. Anyway, so it's tricky. But so I'm not enjoying it as much as I want to be, but
I'm starting to get slightly concerned that we don't see the Zoom like in-person thing. So I just wrote, hopefully everything's okay there.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, we're definitely in the right place because we're all in the same place.
Right. There's only one link.
I don't believe that to be true.
It could be, but like low likelihood.
So low likelihood, yeah, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I just went to the actual like program and went in through there, but that seemed kind of odd that the speakers would go through an area where everybody else would go through. So anyway.
Yeah. It's interestingly set up. Mm-hmm. Zoom. I'm just going to share my little intro slide that I have as we have people coming in.
Hi, this is Ryan from Encore. Can you hear me in the Zoom room?
Yes.
Okay, so I've spoken to Ronda Lo, one of the presenters, so she will have a microphone and can kind of co-facilitate with because the session chair is in the Zoom call, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you can facilitate the session like normal. Rhonda can interact with you if she needs to. Do you know the order at least when Rhonda presents?
Yes, Rhonda's going to go second. We are ready here and share my slide screen, and then I can kind of session from virtual if that's okay.
Yeah, perfect. So when you're facilitating from virtual, if no one has their screen share on, then we can put you up on screen for people to see. But if somebody's sharing, we won't be able to do that. But that's been how it's gone the whole event. So
great, thank you.
Okay, so if everyone is ready, we're ready to go momentarily. Is that a yes?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, we'll give it 30 seconds and then you can go ahead.
Great, thank you. Welcome everyone to Symposium 4, Race, Culture, and Language. This is a Spark-sponsored symposium. We're excited and thankful for Cognitive Science Society for making space for some of our Spark members to present their research. This is our schedule here. We're going to have Dr. Jeni Kubota talking first, then Ronda Lo, Onur Özsoy, and Dr. Arturo Hernandez. And I just want to take a moment to share a little bit about the Spark Society for those who are not familiar with our group. The Spark Society is a nonprofit organization currently funded by the National Science Foundation. We have a mission to support scholars of color who are cognitive psychologists and scientists. We have our aims are to improve the visibility of our membership, create mentorship opportunities for junior scholars of color, and provide a venue for allies to help us achieve these goals. We do have a specific mission on supporting Black, Latinx, and Indigenous scholars, but all are welcome in our membership to support our mission and goals. So without further ado, and without taking any more time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeni Kubota, Associate Professor at the University of Delaware, who's going to be talking about the neuroscience of racial bias.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen. We'll see how this goes. It's always the moment of truth. Okay, can you see just my slides?
Yes, we could see your slides.
Great. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and to obviously the organizers of this fantastic symposium. We all kind of do different things a little bit, so I think it's going to be kind of fun. So I just want to open this Spark Symposium by sharing a little bit about how I came to be a social neuroscientist interested in racial bias. So I grew up in a fairly homogenous place, a small farming town in Wisconsin, where my parents moved to afford a better life. That's actually a picture of the downtown. This is actually one of the farms surrounding my parents' house. And from the moment I began school, I realized my family and I were very different from the families I saw around me. You may notice the lack of diversity in my high school class photo. That's actually my forehead. It turns out shortness is an enduring trait. And as a URM individual, the absence of role models and diversity around me kind of fortified my interest in intergroup dynamics and helped to fuel my commitment to fostering diversity and improving the academic environment of marginalized individuals. So we're obviously increasingly navigating a much more diverse and multicultural environment. And the question becomes, how do we foster equity and inclusion and mitigate racial bias across spheres of society? Well, obviously, this is a hugely complex question, clearly, right? It involves thinking about structures as well as individuals and groups and the bringing together of interdisciplinary teams. But one of the ways to investigate racial bias, the one I use, is to use neuroscience. Neuroscience allows us to measure implicit processes that can impact how we think, feel, and behave in real time as people are viewing marginalized individuals. So we know that from a young age, we're sponges, soaking up information from our culture, our environment, and it's these cultural associations about groups that over time become ingrained in our minds. So When we encounter someone, we spontaneously bring these associations to mind. Even the most well-meaning folks do this. So for example, if I say woman, can you think of a stereotype? My guess is you can, even if you don't believe them. Why? Because you've soaked them up from your culture. Now, social neuroscience is a fantastic tool for taking a peek inside our minds and thinking about the component processes that drive social group biases. Social neuroscientists rely on a combination of measurable neural and physiological responses, as well as actual overt behavior to make inferences about psychological states. This is important for studying racial bias because neuroscience allows us to investigate these questions without asking people how they think and feel directly. This is important because we might not always realize when we're categorizing someone. And another concern is that even when people are aware, they may be reluctant to report it. So let's dive into what neuroscience tells us about racial bias. In our daily lives, we're navigating through these really complex social worlds. And even in these brief encounters, we're rapidly processing social information about others. Who we attend to can depend on a host of factors, including our internal states, the environment, our culture, our language. But by and large, we're doing this spontaneously. Why might we rapidly categorize others? Well, because it's efficient. We use the categories to rapidly predict things about unfamiliar others. This appeals to the cognitive miser inside us all, right? Maximizing information quantity while minimizing effort. So it's really the lazy person's approach. But obviously, just because humans are really good heuristic thinkers doesn't mean the information we access is accurate. What we find using neuroscience is that actually within a second, we quickly acquire a variety of information about those around us, including information about perceived race, gender, age, and emotion. Now, importantly, these are perceived categories, meaning that they may not be accurate, but these perceptions influence how folks think, feel, and behave towards others, even if they're inaccurate categorizations. Now, to understand what we glean from others and how quickly we process social group information, we use EEG in the lab. To measure EEG, we use these caps. They look like swimming caps with sensors embedded all over them. And this allows us to measure with millisecond precision the unfolding electrical activity in the brain as people view others in real time. In the lab, we often strip away context and simply show faces varying in social group membership. And when we do so, we find that individuals process information about perceived race, gender, age, and emotion within 200 milliseconds of encountering someone. That's super fast. So let's see how fast that is. Wow, that's the blink of an eye, really. So this tells us that information about race gets into the system early and can guide impressions. Most importantly, it's spontaneous. So even when I ask you to stop, your brain is still processing this information rapidly. For the remainder of the talk, just because of time constraints, I'm going to focus on race, specifically on how self-identified white Americans process perceived white and Black individuals. But I'd be happy for folks who are interested to discuss how our brains process other social categories or other racial or ethnic groups and how that happens cross-culturally. Now, not only can we understand how fast people process social categories like race, we can also view what areas of the brain are processing race using functional magnetic resonance imaging that measures changes in blood flow within regions of the brain while people perform tasks or view images. One of the first studies actually to explore the neural correlates of racial bias was conducted by Professor Liz Phelps. For this study, self-identified white Americans did something simple. They simply viewed perceived Black and white faces in the scanner. And what they found was very intriguing. They found that a particular region of the brain was sensitive to race. Specifically, they found a relationship between amygdala differences, shown here in the yellow circle, when viewing perceived Black and white faces and implicit racial bias. The more amygdala activity people had when viewing perceived Black relative to white faces, the greater their implicit racial bias. This foundational study led to important insights, but why? Well, because the amygdala is involved in the learning and expression of emotional associations generally, and often responds to emotionally arousing things in the environment, so salient things. This means that how we learn and express racial bias is similar to some extent to how we learn and express other emotional associations. In other words, these old and vital systems are co-opted in a sense to process, in this case, a socially constructed category, race, whose meaning varies across cultures. Therefore, we imbue race with emotional content, and unsurprisingly, it influences how our brains process others. More concretely, the amygdala, actually along with a host of other brain regions, allows humans to be fantastic associative learners. So because of this, when we encounter a group member or group members, we quickly categorize them and then activate a host of associations, some positive, some negative, some neutral. Now for objects, these mental shortcuts are great, right? When I encounter an ice cream cone, I know what to expect, I know whether I like it, I know how to eat it. However, when we're talking about social groups, these shortcuts come with high costs, as stereotypes and prejudices can be inaccurate and harmful. This means that relying on social categorization often leads people to negative assumptions. And neuroscience provides us a way to directly and rigorously interrogate how we learn and express these assumptions and associations. So since the Phelps study on race, researchers have actually found a host of regions involved in racial group processing. And of course, these regions are involved in other types of processes, but we're focusing on perceived race here. So this network represents kind of the usual neural suspects. Specifically, these regions support the identification of faces, the evaluation of other race individuals, how we represent the minds of other race individuals, and the regulation of racial bias, and are very similar to the areas that are involved in the processing and regulation of other emotional and social stimuli. And again, most importantly, it's unintentional. So even when I ask you to stop, people still process this information rapidly, and we can measure this using neuroscience tools. So after that very brief kind of introduction to how we process race and racial bias as we assess it through neuroscience tools, neuroscience not only gives us the ability to kind of peek inside the box to map mechanisms that are important for propelling racial bias, it can also help us identify target interventions. Now, one of the most promising avenues for reducing racial bias that has both behavioral and neuroscience support is via interracial contact, particularly contact that's meaningful, face-to-face, and extended. To begin to understand how meaningful interracial contact shapes racial bias, we began by asking a pretty simple question. How does it impact evaluative associations or implicit racial bias? So to explore this question, we had a racially diverse group of adults complete an implicit association task. Here, they're categorizing words and faces as fast and accurately as they can, and people are facilitated to categorize these words and faces when the labels at the top are paired stereotypically, so black and bad share a response key and white and good share a response key, compared to when they are paired counter-stereotypically, so black and good versus white and bad. So we had them take this IAT, and then we asked them a few questions about their previous interracial contact. Specifically, we asked them to consider their contact with white and black individuals across their lifetime. And we focused on meaningful contact with friends, caregivers, neighbors, and classmates from 4 age groups. So before age 6, 6 to 12, 13 to 18, and currently. So they reported their contact across their lifetime. So this contact measure is actually what I'm going to be focusing on for the remainder of the talk. Okay, well, what did we find? Well, here I'm showing you implicit racial bias scores from the IAT on the y-axis. Greater numbers mean more implicit racial bias, and interracial contact scores are on the x-axis, with greater numbers meaning more contact with Black individuals relative to white individuals during the participant's lifetime. The red line would represent no implicit racial bias. In this study, we found that greater quality of contact with Black individuals compared with white individuals was associated with a decrease in implicit racial bias. And this was actually true at any point in the lifespan. Interestingly, this result is only for meaningful contact or contact that doesn't support a segregated system. So what I'm showing you right now is a segregation map of the United States. The different colors represent different racial groups. So when colors are commingled but blocked, the area is highly segregated. And when places are diverse but segregated, there's actually an opposite relationship. So there's greater negative implicit racial bias among white individuals. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that means that quality of contact reduces implicit racial bias, but quantity does not necessarily do so, particularly in places that are segregated. So for counties that are highly diverse and segregated, you actually see the opposite pattern, that greater quantity of contact increases implicit racial bias. So not all contact is the same. It can have different kinds of effects, even on the same thing. So in this case, implicit racial bias. Now, that doesn't mean that all kinds of quantity of contact can't impact how we process race. So for example, when we become familiar with individuals but don't yet have that deep quality contact, is this sufficient to change how we process others based on race? Well, Professor Cloutier and colleagues were some of the first researchers to explore this question. In this study, participants first familiarized themselves with perceived white and Black faces. Then they went into the scanner and they saw faces. Some of these faces were new, so they were novel, and some of the faces they had already seen, so they were familiar. So what happened? Well, here I'm showing you amygdala activity. Again, remember that the amygdala is involved in the learning and expression of evaluative associations generally, and often responds to arousing and salient things in the environment. Amygdala activity is on the y-axis, so greater numbers mean more amygdala activity, and the kinds of perceived Black and white faces people saw are on the x-axis. First, what they found for novel faces was similar to what Phelps and Banaji had found in 2000. The amygdala was more sensitive to perceived Black than white faces for self-identified white Americans. However, when individuals were more familiar with perceived Black and white faces, the amygdala differences disappeared. Even more interesting, this effect is stronger for folks who have more childhood interracial contact. In fact, in this study, they were able to show that greater interracial childhood contact reduced amygdala responses in adulthood. That's 18 plus years later. Now, early fMRI work really focused on specific regions of the brain, but contemporary neuroscience work also considers how entire networks of the brain are coordinating. And what is really fascinating is that interracial contact not only shapes how one region of the brain responds, but in fact, our recent research demonstrates that contact shapes how entire networks of the brain respond to others, particularly those involved in social cognition and mentalizing, or theory of mind. Now, to assess how contact shapes mentalizing, we turn to the reading the mind in the eyes task. So this task shown here is framed as a theory of mind task, where people are asked to attribute mental states from only eyes. They're given 4 options, and for folks playing along, for this face, the response option that is correct is preoccupied. But this task is often not included non-white faces. So to remedy this lack of inclusion, we created a match version of the RME task featuring perceived Black individuals. So this is the same matched expression you just saw. And again, the consensus response that people give is preoccupied. These stimuli are actually publicly available for download for folks who are interested, and there's a published paper to accompany them. So my graduate student, Grace Hanley, brought in 58 self-identified white individuals who varied in interracial contact into the lab and scanned them while they performed the interracial RME task. Okay, so what happened? Well, here I'm showing you superior temporal sulcus activity. The STS is involved in inferring mental states as part of the mentalizing network. It's particularly involved in inferring mental states from perceptual cues. On the y-axis, greater numbers mean more STS activity, and interracial contact scores are again on the x-axis, with greater numbers meaning more contact with Black individuals relative to white individuals. And what we found was that for folks with more contact, they engaged the STS similarly when mentalizing about perceived Black and white faces. Note, we found a similar pattern actually in temporal parietal junction, which is another region involved in theory of mind or mentalizing. So greater contact leads folks to engage similar mentalizing processes for perceived Black and white individuals in this study. Also, for folks with less contact, we found the typical effect that individuals engage more activity in mentalizing regions for in-group members relative to out-group members. So these were all self-identified white Americans. Now, individuals may also be more motivated to understand certain kinds of intergroup interactions and engage more mentalizing processes for perceived Black relative to white individuals. So for example, when they perceive the potential for racial injustice. So people may be motivated to preferentially understand the dynamics of these interactions when they perceive injustice towards those whose communities experience disproportionate policing. To explore mentalizing processes when viewing aggressive interracial police encounters, my graduate student, Sephora Dang, brought in 69 self-identified white individuals from the US and scanned them while they watched audio-less real-world videos of perceived white officers arresting a perceived Black or a white civilian. Some of these arrests were less aggressive, while others were more aggressive. And we again had participants complete the interracial contact questionnaire in this study. So those videos are also available for public download for folks who are interested. So what did we find? Well, I'm showing you temporal parietal junction activity on the y-axis. Greater numbers mean more TPJ activity as police interactions became more aggressive. And civilian race is on the x-axis. What we found was that TPJ activity was greater when viewing perceived Black versus white civilians involved in more aggressive police arrests. So folks engaged more mentalizing processes when watching these videos, right? The videos of the Black civilians, but why? Well, it wasn't all folks that did this, actually. So this effect was greater for folks who have more interracial contact. So I'm going to show you two lines, one for videos of perceived Black civilians, the dotted line, and one for perceived white civilians, the solid line. What we found was that for folks with more contact, they had increased TPJ activity as aggression in the police encounters increased for videos featuring a perceived Black compared to a white civilian. A similar pattern was also observed in other regions involved in theory of mind and mentalizing, so the STS and also the DMPFC. So these findings suggest that in situations where racial injustice may occur, people with greater contact display greater scrutiny of these videos, showing aggressive arrests of perceived Black versus white civilians by perceived white officers.
Jeni, can you wrap up a little bit?
Yep. Yeah, I just have 2 more slides. So this study represents a starting place for much needed research into the neuroscience of social injustice and the use of more kind of complex dynamic stimuli actually in these studies. But findings from this research may not generalize, right? May not generalize to all samples, stimuli, or cultures. And additionally, just because individuals engage more mentalizing processes, it doesn't mean that perceivers felt more empathy, viewed the interactions as immoral, or would take action to change the situation. So this work is an important step forward, but it's a starting place. Additionally, hinting at some of our future work, research should also examine reactions to watching these arrests or violence with a sample of explicitly biased individuals, right? Because these individuals might actually like violence and perceive it as just. So what are some key takeaways? Well, social neuroscience is an important tool for interrogating racial bias. Learning and processing social group membership occurs kind of in a similar fashion to other emotional stimuli. And contact may be a powerful way to change racial bias. So contact may work as an intervention in some situations, but of course, it's not always feasible. It puts minoritized folks in spaces they might not want to be, and developing meaningful contact is a real challenge. So obviously, it's not a perfect solution, and more work clearly needs to be done. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I just want to thank all my lab members and the funding agencies that have supported this work over the years. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeni, for a great talk. We have time for a question if there's one while Rhonda gets set up in person.
Thanks so much, folks. You can find me, email me if you have additional questions later on.
Thank you again. Rhonda, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Hello? Oh, okay, yes. Okay. All right, we'll start. So thank you guys so much for coming to see the session. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys about some work that I've been doing for my dissertation that centers around socio-cultural factors that shape social attention. And so, you know, like Jennifer said earlier, like maybe race is really important when it comes to figuring out where people are going to attend to in social contexts. But I also want to talk about culture as another really important socio-cultural factor when it comes to how people calibrate their social attentions and choose where to pay attention to. So gazes are a social cue that we often use to infer information about our environments. When we see someone gaze in a direction, we typically follow those gazes. And this shifting of attention via gaze cues is so strong that we can actually detect targets in the same direction as the gaze far faster than targets that don't appear in the same direction as this gaze. Even when we tell people that the gaze will never inform you where the target is going to be, so you should ignore the gaze, people actually can't. They will still shift their attention according to wherever the gaze is looking. And so this really powerful effect is called the gaze cueing effect, where people tend to shift their attention in a kind of automatic manner in the direction of where the gaze is looking. Okay. And when there are multiple gaze cues, how your attention prioritizes which gaze cue to process can be shaped by social factors such as culture. So, for example, in this display, the central foreground gaze and the background gaze are looking in different directions. They have conflicting gaze cues. So the person in the front is looking towards the left, the people in the back are looking towards the right. And previous work using the multiple gaze paradigm has found that when Americans look at this scene, they pay more attention to this foreground gaze here, and they kind of are able to center their attention there and kind of ignore what's happening in the background. This might be because they consider foreground information to be like kind of the important central focal place to look, and they kind of consider these background gazes as irrelevant. They're not really important in terms of processing this important central guy here. However, when you give this task to East Asians, they actually consider the gaze cues in the background as important social contexts. And so actually, they're not able to ignore these gaze cues when you present them with these conflicting foreground, background gaze displays. They might try to pay attention to the foreground, but they actually get super distracted by these gazes happening in the background. And so these cultural differences between Americans and East Asians can be detected as quickly as 600 milliseconds, suggesting that culture is shaping these kind of split-second social attention processes that we tend to think of as relatively impenetrable to social cultural factors. So why does culture matter for social attention? Well, cultural variation in cognition is broadly thought to be influenced by predominant self-construal styles endorsed by different cultures. So Western cultures, such as Canada or the US, they tend to think of themselves as kind of distinct and independent from those around them, even with close others, actually. Whereas in East Asian cultures, people tend to think of close others as interconnected and inseparable, you know, whether you like it or not. So these self-construals or social orientations are largely considered the explanatory mechanism underlying cultural variation in attention styles. However, what would happen if the foreground and the background gaze cues are on different race faces? So intergroup social cognitive research suggests that people tend to exhibit an own race bias, which is also known by a few other terms like cross-race effect or the in-group advantage, if specifically in an interracial context. Which is where people are better at processing, remembering, and identifying faces from the same race face compared to faces from other races. When it comes to gaze cueing with singular gazes, there's also research that suggests that people tend to be cued or tend to exhibit gaze cueing effects more strongly from same race faces than other race faces. This means that by using a multiple gaze paradigm that varies by race, there's an interesting opportunity here to examine whether the race of the gazes would actually disrupt typical cultural patterns of gaze cueing. So in a gaze cueing context such as this, where the foreground and the background gazes are mismatched, the conflict with where to pay attention to now allows us to manipulate attention to the foreground and background with same race faces. So in a context like this, with an Asian foreground gaze and white background faces, would, for example, European Canadians still shift their attention according to the foreground gaze? Even though the foreground gaze is Asian and the background gazes are all white, will they still kind of exhibit this more Western typical gaze cueing pattern where they pay attention to the foreground and ignore gaze cues from the background? Or instead, would they actually pay attention to those white faces in the background because they're now there is now an in-group motivation to pay attention to those gaze cues in the background that they wouldn't normally pay attention to. And then also, you know, in another, and so for East Asians, would they still process both the foreground and the background gaze cues as before, based off of their cultural experience paying attention to the social context? So, you know, disregarding that the person in the front is like their own group to pay attention to, would they still kind of pay attention to everyone equally? Or would they end up paying more attention to this foreground Asian face because it is a member of their own group? And so effectively, I want to ask, you know, is race more important in this context, or is it culture? It's kind of like a race culture like competition here. And so for the current study, I used an online asynchronous design to test East Asians and Euro-Canadians during the pandemic. And so this means that I basically programmed the task, put it online, and got people to do it. But you might anticipate that there are complications and technical issues that people run into, and I often have to discard a lot of data. So, you know, for full transparency, this is how much I had to discard. And if you want to discuss later on about the issues of testing asynchronously online, we can talk about that later. But basically, I ended up with initially 112 participants evenly split between Euro-Canadians and East Asians, but I actually lost 47 of those participants due to reported disruptions or like detected misbehavior. Sometimes I would like see like their reaction times are like too fast to be possible. Also sometimes so fast that I can see that they skip the entire task, or in order to control for visual stimuli presented at the same size for each computer monitor, I also get them to adjust their monitor in the game via like a remote card sizing task, which allows me to resize all images to present at the exact same size for every single person, regardless of the size of their computer monitor. Sometimes they also report doing the task on a too small computer monitor, and then one person didn't fulfill cultural background requirements. So in the end, I ended up with 64 participants with 28 Euro-Canadians who all identified as white with European descent, with themselves and their parents both born in Canada, which is kind of hard to do. I'm from Toronto, so it's like everyone is like an immigrant. So this sample is actually kind of hard to obtain, so we had to like make sure to screen for these particular eligibility requirements. I also recruited 36 East Asians. It's a bit harder to collect this sample, so I kept the eligibility requirements open to collect as much Asian data as possible in the semester. And yeah, I thought I would end up with more East Asians from East Asia, like international students, but I actually ended up with way more Asian Canadian students. And so these were those who were either born in East Asia and arrived in Canada before the ages of 6 or 7, so what we would call 1.5 generation, or second generation Canadians, so those who were born in Canada with their parents born in East Asia. And then I ended up with, so 2/3 of the sample was actually Asian Canadians, whereas 1/3 of the sample was East Asians that were more recently arrived. And so you can see the average age of arrival is around 17, so that's pretty on par with like international student samples. And as you could tell, I like recruited these participants through our first year psychology course at York University, which is where I'm doing my PhD. Okay, so, whoops, sorry. So participants completed the online multi-gaze cueing task, and in this task, we manipulated the race of the foreground gaze to be either white or East Asian, and note that the background gazes were always white in this case. In this task, participants are told that a target, this white square on the right side, would eventually appear on either the left or right side of the screen, and that once they see the target, they should press spacebar. And we measured the reaction time to responding to this target. There were 4 different types of trials in the task. So there were matched trials where the foreground gaze and the background gaze were in the same direction. So you can see these top trials, all the eyes are looking in the same direction. But it could also vary by congruency, where the foreground gaze could be cueing the correct location of the target or not. So you can see on the top left square, all the gazes are looking the same direction, but they're looking away from the target, so it's an incongruent trial. And then the other one, all of the gazes are looking towards the target, so it's a congruent trial. However, in this study, our interest is actually in these mismatched trials in which the foreground and the background gazes are looking in different directions. And again, the foreground gaze would also either be congruently or incongruently cueing the location of the target, which also means that the background gazes are in the opposite direction at all times. Our dependent variable of interest was the cueing effect, which is an index that represents how much participants are getting cued by the foreground gaze. And we can calculate this index by subtracting congruent trials from incongruent trials for each condition. So for mismatch, we would subtract incongruent trials minus congruent trials. If we expect that someone is only looking at the foreground gaze, we would anticipate that the incongruent trial would take longer to respond to, and so the cueing effect would be a larger positive number. And so correspondingly, if the background gazes are influencing people's gazes in either the incongruent or congruent trials, then the cueing effect may be closer to 0 or even negative. So in this case, we would be anticipating that higher gaze cueing effects would suggest attention to the foreground. So each trial started off with an initial phase with all faces having direct gazes with a fixation cross for 500 milliseconds, after which the gaze cues appeared, where each face would be either gazing left or gazing right. And there were also direct gazes intermixed in the cue phase to provide trial diversity. Afterwards, a target phase would appear in which a white square would appear on either the left or right side of the screen. The target randomly appeared after either 200 or 600 milliseconds after the cue. And these different durations refer to stimulus onset asynchrony, or SOA. And I included both variations of SOA here for 200 and 600 milliseconds for trial diversity reasons. You know, you can't have participants know that the target will always appear after 200 milliseconds. They'll just like click like automatically like that. So it's important to have that diversity, especially in an asynchronous online task, but also because for theoretical reasons, both culture and race effects have been observed at both SOAs. And so I wanted to include both because I was unsure about which SOA I would observe effects in my study. Altogether, I had 344 critical trials to do my analysis. In this study, I only anticipated that I would mostly get East Asians from East Asia and that I would exclude any Canadian East Asians. But because I actually ended up with more Asian Canadians, enough to analyze as its own group, I actually decided to preserve the 3 cultural groups because I thought it would be interesting to demonstrate whether the pattern of results are similar between Asian Canadians and East Asians, despite Asian Canadians having a far longer experience living in a predominantly white Western context. And so yeah, I analyzed all 3 groups. Okay, so to orient you to the results, the bar graph I'll show you refers to cueing effects as the dependent variable on the y-axis. Like I said before, positive cueing effects refer to attention that is cued in the direction of the foreground gaze, suggesting kind of like a foreground gaze attention bias. Cueing effects near 0 or negative suggest no systematic bias of the foreground compared to the background gazes. So under mismatched conditions where the foreground and background had conflicting gaze cues, we observed a 3-way interaction between cultural foreground race and SOA. And we further decomposed the interaction by SOA. And so here on the left side is the results for under 200 milliseconds. So which refers to a relatively early stage of attention. And we find that there is a difference in cueing effect only for Asian Canadians with respect to the foreground race of the gaze. Where Asian Canadians actually saw an Asian foreground with white background, they were actually biased towards where the Asian foreground gaze was looking. So that's that dark gray bar on the left side. However, when they saw a white foreground with a white background gaze, they were not affected by the foreground gaze at all. In fact, they actually might have been looking towards where the background gaze is. So you can see that like light gray bar that's like going negative, suggesting that actually their attention might be biased towards the background. And so this suggests that Asian Canadians kind of exhibit or are favoring paying attention to that Asian foreground gaze, but otherwise would not be looking at the foreground gaze. Oh yeah. However, when we see the East Asians and Euro-Canadian group, it seems like the foreground race doesn't seem to matter. There were no significant cueing effects here. And so you can see all those bars are not any different than 0, suggesting that there was actually no systematic bias of the foreground gaze in these contexts. And so it seems like they were attending to the entire social context, and they were not being particularly cued by the foreground gaze. For East Asians, I would anticipate this based off of prior research using a multi-gaze paradigm. However, this was a little unexpected for the Euro-Canadians because this suggests that they weren't particularly interested in paying attention to the foreground gaze at all compared to the background gazes. So this was a little bit unexpected, but still kind of interesting because this might mean that in a context where the race of the foreground gaze might be changing, it could present a bit more cognitive load in terms of processing these displays relatively quickly and responding quickly. So yeah, that was kind of interesting. When it came to the 600 milliseconds SOA, which is the later stage of attention, there were no differences in cueing effect at all, and none were different than 0. So this suggests that by 600 milliseconds, which is within the automatic cueing interval, but it's still a little bit in the later stage, all groups kind of regardless of the race of the foreground paid attention to the entire social context, and they did not shift their attention according to the foreground gaze. So overall, it seemed like Asian Canadians exhibited a cultural pattern to attend to the entire social context when all the faces were the same race, but they pay attention to the foreground gaze when the foreground is the same race face, suggesting that the race of the face seems to play an important role in how people distribute their attention. Oops. However, this was not the case at all for our East Asians or Euro-Canadians. So why was there such a big difference between these two groups and the Asian Canadians? The big difference, I think, was how much experience they have growing up in an intergroup context altogether, which is something that I didn't initially exactly consider when I was thinking about my culture versus race competition. Just like how I theorized that cultural upbringing in an independent or interdependent society promotes less or more attention to the social context, having an intergroup upbringing as a racial minority might promote greater attention to your in-group. So for an East Asian recently arrived from East Asia, they are maybe unlikely to experience this long-term intergroup context that might promote the same greater attention to your in-group members. After all, if you grew up in East Asia, seeing an Asian face may not be that special or attention-grabbing, but for Asian Canadians, this might not be the case. Future directions in this work include replicating this study, firstly maybe with a synchronous study instead, because asynchronous, you saw there how much data attrition there was. In a task like this that seems to be a bit complicated and kind of hard, I might anticipate more trouble retaining participants throughout the study. And so I would replicate it with a bigger sample size and using synchronous Zoom sessions. I would also want to rule out the possibility of contrast effects if Asian Canadians were maybe paying attention to the Asian foreground gaze because of some in-group bias, or they might be paying attention to it because it's visually salient. And so maybe another way to test this would be to look at trials in which the background gazes are Asian instead, and the foreground is white. And if I observe effects in that type of trial, then it might suggest that they are sensitive to more like structural features of the different race faces, and not necessarily because they're interested in their own group member. And so I hope that it's clear from my work that when it comes to examining culture or race as a factor, it's important to consider your participants' cultural and intergroup experiences, which is something that I initially didn't consider when collecting both recent arrived East Asians and Asian Canadians. But both cultural and intergroup experiences turned out to play an important role in explaining how Euro-Canadians, Asian Canadians, and East Asians differed in their social attention patterns. So thank you very much for listening to my talk today, and I'm happy to welcome any questions.
Thank you, Rhonda. That was very great. Any questions coming through online? I can relay. I don't see anything yet. I don't know if there's anything in the room.
Oh, yeah.
Quick question. Thank you. It was a really great talk and cool study. Just a small question. Did you ask them the demographics questions before doing the experiment?
So because we collected it through our research pool, we have pre-screened items that we submit like months in advance. So we did have some idea of being able to screen in the participants that we wanted. However, it's at this point of the data collection, I just wanted to collect as many as possible because I just wasn't sure if I would have enough. So I just opened it up to everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering, I always think this because I ask a lot of demographic questions before doing a behavioral task where maybe it's relevant, like if it could be priming, it would still be, it's interesting if you get priming for East Asian, like if they're answering, if they're thinking about identifying as a East Asian right before they do the task, if it matters.
That's right, yeah. We always ask our demographics at the end for this reason. Okay. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I should probably do that. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi, thanks for the really interesting talk. I love bringing in the in-group advantage part to the gaze studies. It's really, really cool. I had two questions. One, I think you partially addressed, it was about sort of, I guess, socialization patterns. So like, for instance, if you're an Asian person raised in like a very small, like white town, you kind of your in-group, but you sort of tackled that, I think, with the Asian Canadian part of it. I guess my second question was more about distinguishing between social attention, just like literal visual attention when you're doing these sorts of tasks. So like, for instance, I can imagine if instead of Asian faces, contrasting with the white faces, it was something like South Asian faces or black faces, there might be more of like a visual salience difference between the two.
Yes.
So I was wondering if that's something you've taken into account or other people have looked at or things like that.
Yeah, so I was worried about this contrast effect. So I actually deliberately chose white faces. Like when I was making this task, I chose faces that were like with darker hair and darker eyes, because I wanted to try to rule out the possibility that these gaze cueing effects are happening because of a visual salience between the two races. So while I can't really, I don't really know whether it's because of that. I guess I would have to like maybe run another study where I like flip the races from the foreground background to see whether it's an in-group an effect or like a really sensitive like contrast effect between these two races. But otherwise, yeah, I agree that that is an important consideration. Like, for example, I was thinking about also doing this task with black faces and white faces as well, because I think that would be really interesting, especially because of the gaze cueing effects research has often used white and black faces. But in a multiple gaze context, it's hard because are you just paying attention to these groups of faces because they look really different. The dark skin on the black faces makes them pop out really differently than the white faces. So yeah, I think the faces here are okay in terms of like the contrast, but I'd welcome any other suggestions about how to deal with this potential confound, right? Yeah, so, but that's a great question. Yeah, it's an important consideration.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking more about generalizing to other races, but it seems like you addressed that. Like for this specific case of East Asians versus like white people, it seems like the best control you could possibly do with the hair. I didn't even think about that. So.
Yeah. For other cultural groups, I think this is really important as well, and actually probably really relevant here in Toronto, where everyone is like super different looking. Actually, even it might sometimes even be hard to tell like what your cultural background is, right? And so maybe. I think, yeah, more work should be done on this type of more dynamic, maybe cultural group settings in this type of task. For example, maybe something more like diverse in terms of like the faces in the background or something like that, where it's all kinds of like cultural backgrounds represented or something, instead of just doing one group or another, because I guess it more closely maps into real life, and then maybe might get around this idea of like contrast versus not contrast, because like not all people of color are dark skinned either, right? So I think it would be harder, I think, to interpret the effects, but I think they would be closer to reality in that case. So, yeah.
Totally. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Rhonda, so much for your presentation today. And we'll go ahead and transition to our next speaker, Onur Özsoy. Go ahead and share your slides and take it away.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. Right. Hi, I'm Onur, and this is work that I've done together with Frederick Blum, who is a PhD student at the Max Planck Institute for Evolution and Anthropology, and I'm located in Berlin at the Leibniz Center General Linguistics. And our talk is titled "I Heard You Speaker by Any Other Name." Maybe you can see the reference the reference. And we'll look at diversity in speech fluency, in particular, focusing at discourse markers, and we'll define what those are. This is a pretty standard roadmap for a talk. So we'll focus on a few different things in this talk. If it feels like it's too many different topics, you can read it up. I will actually already post the link in the chat for the people who want to look at the paper afterwards. So we just submitted this to the special issue in applied psycholinguistics, and are looking forward to the feedback that we got today also. And what we did in this paper is that we looked at individual variation in discourse markers in data Bayesian linear regression, and built the model a bit differently than people usually do it in our field. We specifically looked at the speakers and included them as random effects instead of as fixed effects, what is a thing that a lot of people usually do in our field. And we want to kind of talk about the issues of native speakerism, monolingualism, and baselines in bilingualism research. And to do this, we first kind of have to understand what kind of monolingualism is existent in our field. So my field is heritage language research, the most narrow field definition that I can make. And the idea of a heritage speaker is someone who acquired a minority heritage language. So for example, someone who lives in Germany and like me learned Turkish from their family, and then later in kindergarten, in school, and throughout the whole socialization, acquired a majority societal language. So in Germany, that would be German. And often these speakers are compared directly to monolingual so-called controls or baselines. And a lot of people in our field still use these terms and kind of see monolinguals as the baseline to compare heritage speakers to. But in reality, most language users, including all of the speakers that we have in our studies, are multilingual anyway. And the true monolinguals are really rare to find, and even those speakers obviously have different dialects, maybe that they speak, different registers. So in framing monolinguals as a baseline, we seem to be simplifying things. And the field of heritage languages was established in the past 2 decades. It focused largely on Russian and Spanish in the United States and in its initial phase, and still those are the most studies are on these languages. But there is more and more research on a lot of different heritage languages, specifically in the past 10 years. And what people often do is they compare group means. So they look at the group of monolingual speakers of Russian in Russia, and let's say heritage speakers of Russian in the US, and then they come to certain conclusions. But many studies in heritage language research, and probably many more who didn't make it through the publication path, don't find robust differences between these groups. And these are just a few examples for those. And the study that we're looking at here is also one of these. So based on these ideas, we asked 2 questions in the study. The first one is very simple. Do heritage speakers of Turkish produce more discourse markers than monolingual speakers in our group? So this is a very standard question in the field. And the second question, and this is maybe the novel aspect of this, is are the groups homogeneous? So is there a homogeneous monolingual group and a homogeneous heritage speaker group? Or is there a wide variation between the speakers across groups? So is there a lot of individual variation that really drives the data? And we have pre-registered our hypotheses to these research questions. And we thought just to answer these 2 questions with yes and no. For the first question, we expected to see some kind of differences in discourse marker use. So we answered this with yes, and with some more specific hypotheses. And the second question we answered also yes. So we also think there is a lot of individual variation, and we will explore this with our data. And the data that we have is from 186 age-matched participants from the RUIC corpus. That's just the name of the research unit that I work in. And we have roughly 60 speakers from Turkey, Germany, and the US. And these are all Turkish speakers. And obviously the speakers in Turkey are homeland speakers. Most of them are monolinguals, according to a broad definition of monolingualism. And then we have bilinguals in Germany and the US who speak Turkish as a heritage language, and then either German or English as a majority language. And these participants provided naturalistic narrations in 4 register situations. On the next slide, you'll see a bit more on this. And after annotating all of these data, we ran a query for manually annotated discourse markers. And that's the data that we'll specifically look at today. So what is the language situations method that was used here? It's a method in which participants see a video of a mild fictional car accident. So these 2 cars have a little car crash, no one gets hurt, but there is a big audio noise that makes clear to participants that an accident happens and people get a bit excited about it. And this is a relatively naturalistic situation. And specifically in the task, participants narrated what they saw there in 4 situations. So they were brought into one room, which was supposed to be the informal situation, where they got a phone in their hand and narrated a WhatsApp voice recording to a friend. That was a spoken informal situation, and a WhatsApp message to a friend that they typed, and that was the informal written situation. And then they went into a different room where everyone was dressed very formally, and we made a few other adjustments. And here they narrated to the police. They gave a spoken witness report to the police of what they saw. And they also wrote down this witness report. So these are the data that we got from this task. And before we proceed, let's also kind of understand the main discourse markers that we have in the data. So these are just 3 very common discourse markers in Turkish. There's Yani, which you might also know from some other languages in the Middle East. But in Turkish, this means something like I mean. So it's a very frequently used filler particle discourse marker. And you can also use it to combine certain clauses or to introduce a clarification. If you realize that your interlocutor is kind of not understanding what you're saying, you can introduce this and provide a clarification. Then there's işte, which means something like you know, and it's very, very much used like the English you know. And this is kind of a focus particle that you put after maybe a certain phrase or clause that you want to focus on. And then there's şey, which literally means thing, but it doesn't really mean thing. It's more used like the English So it's a filled pause often. And this is used for lexical recall very often. So if you can't think of the word, of the concept, then you might use şey. And these are just the 3 most common discourse markers that also a lot of people worked on in Turkish and that are also the most common in our data. And discourse marker use, as you can imagine, is naturally highly variable. It depends on how tired a person is, how excited they are maybe, and a lot of other factors. And in perception of speech, discourse markers are also kind of an indicator of perceived competence. So if a person uses, I think this one study that we're referring to found that if people use 2 to 5 discourse markers a minute, they're kind of perceived to be relatively competent speakers. But then after that level, it gets somehow annoying for the comprehenders, and the perception of competence goes down. Right, then let's look at the model that we, at the modeling that we did with these data. So we ran a Bayesian linear regression with varying effects for the individual, so the speaker and group variation. And this is a binomial or Bernoulli distribution, specifically the binomial distribution for the probability of discourse markers in different positions. So you can imagine in a sentence, a discourse marker can appear at the beginning of the sentence, that would be initial. In the middle of the sentence, that would be medial, or at the end, that would be final. And then other variables that we had is the dependent variable, that's really the discourse marker. So is a word a discourse marker or not? The utterance length, so how long is this utterance that the discourse marker occurs in? Then the register, remember the WhatsApp message versus the police report. The ID of the speaker, so that's the speaker variable, and the group variable. And here we had these 3 groups, so the monolinguals in Turkey, the heritage speakers in the US, and the heritage speakers in Germany. For those of you who are familiar with this kind of notation from the BRMS package in R, so we have the dependent variable, the discourse marker, then we have an intercept, then we have the position, the register, and the utterance length as fixed effects, and we have a nested random effect for group, for speaker over group over position, and these are relatively weakly informed priors that match our data. You can also find the data and the code at this link. And let's move on to the results to answer the questions that we had asked. So first, let's look at our fixed effects. So one effect was register, where we had informal and formal register. And we see that in informal registers, the use of discourse markers increases. This is one of our 2 stronger predictors. And it almost doubles. So 0.5 would be that the use of discourse markers doubles in informal register. For utterance length, we see that longer utterances also lead to a high use of discourse markers. This is probably not surprising, because if you say more things, you can use more discourse markers. And then we had the position effect with 3 levels. And here we see a relatively medium effect for the initial position. So there is a high use of discourse markers, sentence initially or utterance initially. And this is also what a lot of the literature has been reporting. So these effects kind of all look fine, in line with the general predictions for discourse markers. And now let's look at what we're interested in, what we asked the questions for. So the first question is, are we going to find differences between these 3 groups of speakers in Germany, Turkey, and the US? And here we show 3 subplots for the group level effects according to utterance position. So we have the initial position, the medial one, and the final one in the sentence. And we see here the highest density posterior interval, the 95% interval. And purple represents Germany, blue represents Turkey, and green represents the US. And let's just go through them position by position. So for the initial position, we see that the effects largely overlap, and we don't really have any strong differences between the groups. The Turkey group has a slightly higher estimate, but really there's a high overlap, so no real group level effect here. Then let's look at the medial position. Here we see a similar thing, the high overlap, but the heritage groups, so the Germany and the USA group, have slightly higher estimates, which kind of indicates that there's a slightly lower use of discourse markers in the Turkey group, but again, really a very, very small effect. And this effect is reversed in the final position. So here we see a really slightly higher use of discourse markers in Turkey. But I mean, you see all of these box plots show so much overlap. So we can't really come to the conclusion that there is any meaningful strong group level effect. And instead, let's look at the speaker level effects for transposition. So here again, we have the posterior distribution per speaker. So each dot represents a speaker. And again, we have this split up by the 3 positions. And this time we have 3 rows for the groups. So the colors are the same. We have at the top the Germany group, in the middle the Turkey group, and at the bottom the USA group. And we see already that if we look at just the positions and the groups, they all look very similar. There's a lot of variation. There's some speakers who barely use any discourse markers in the initial position, and there's some who use a lot, and there's a lot of variation. And this variation is persistent across all groups. And yeah, basically we see more variance according to utterance position than per group. And this indicates that there's a lot of speaker level variance. If we quantify this, we see for different positions. So we see that for the initial position, there's 3 times as much variation within each of the groups than between the groups. And for the medial and the final position, it's almost 6 times as much variation within the groups than between the groups. All right, that's it with the results, and that leads us to our discussion, which is also kind of the main takeaways. So we see much bigger variation in the speaker than in the group. And remember, this was a heritage language study where often the monolingual group, so in our case, the Turkey group, would be kind of treated as a baseline. And we see here in these data and in many other studies in our field that monolinguals are not an adequate or in anyhow homogeneous baseline. And this allows us to unmask the kind of native speakerism and monolingualism that is kind of idealized and probably ideologized also in these studies. We don't really need monolingual comparisons in a study where we look at discourse marker use in heritage speakers, and this is true for many, many other linguistic phenomena. So we should always ask in bilingualism studies, when do we really need baselines, or do we need baselines at all? And we can, from this study, also see that heritage varieties of languages are also native varieties, and we should just treat them like homeland varieties. And it shouldn't really be important if it's monolingual or bilingual. We should rather look at it from a maybe variationist perspective and treat it all as part of a native language continuum, and then we can investigate different phenomena along this axis. That's it for the talk. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm very happy to take your questions and comments.
Thank you so much for a great talk. We can take questions. I'm not seeing anything in the chat online, but in person, if there's anything as well.
There are no questions on the floor.
Okay. And I'm not seeing any more anything coming through online. I just want to say thank you very much for this talk. I think it's a really nice demonstration of this issue of group comparisons between monolinguals and bilinguals, and do we need the baseline? I love that question. So thank you for sharing these data with us today.
Thank you.
All right, so with that, we can move to our final speaker, Dr. Arturo Hernandez. Feel free to share your slides.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So it's interesting. This follows up a lot on a very similar topic that has to do with, in this case, English. And I'd like to bring up sort of a point which is sometimes lost on people. And in this case, I'd like to talk about Joseph Conrad, who was a Polish native speaker, learned Latin and Greek, I guess in school at home, spoke fluent French, but had a very terrible accent in English. Apparently his English was just horrid, spoken English. But we all know that from his writing, it was not horrid, right? Heart of Darkness, considered, a classic piece of literature with beautiful, I mean, you can read this in more detailed, right? But he has this, like, if you just read this carefully, you can see that it's just it's so pretty and so melodic and so nice for a non-native speaker. And what the talk's going to kind of reflect on today is kind of this topic or this idea about what a monolingual is, specifically with regard to English. And work in the past has looked at, how we vary from narrative spoken to narrative written to expository spoken to expository written. So narrative being like a story, much like Heart of Darkness would be, right? That would be the spoken version of a narrative, telling a friend something that happened to you the day before. Narrative written, which would be more like a Heart of Darkness. Expository spoken, what I'm doing right now, which is kind of talking about science and language with all of you. And then expository written, if I was actually writing an article. And we know when we look at the percentage of Latin, right? So Latin items, and I'll explain more precisely what derived from Latin, such as words expository and narrative. When we go from grade school, so this is work done by Bar-Ilan and Berman, when we go from grade school to junior high to high school to adult, what you see across in narrative and especially in expository is an increase in the proportion of words that come from Latin, with adult expository, basically science texts, if you will, or written texts describing some kind of phenomena being very, very Latin-based. We can also see this, and this story is kind of backwards because I discovered Bar-Ilan's work from 2007 after I kind of stumbled on this topic myself. We can also see this in the 50 most frequent nouns in English monolinguals, right? So again, we're back to considering people that are native speakers of English and that only speak one language, which would be English in this case. And if we look at 18-month-olds, so those who, that's from the MacArthur-Bates Developmental Inventory, we look at the words, the 50 most frequent nouns that parents say their 18-month-olds can say, right? Then what we find is that the vast majority have a Germanic or English root. Only 18% have Latin. If we do adult every day, that's American soap operas. Then we see it's about half. And if we go to CELIX, which is adult academic language, we see then it becomes much more like Latin. And you can also see it in the school district. So this is from a school district in Washington State that finds that when we look at prefixes and suffixes that are learned by grade level, that in grade 1, right? So you can see that the number of prefixes and suffixes are mostly English derived or Anglo-Saxon or Germanic, whichever word you want to use. There becomes a little bit of Latin in 2nd grade. And as we go through schooling and we go up all the way up to 8th grade, you can see that in fact, in 8th grade, it becomes primarily Latin and Greek prefixes and suffixes that are being learned. So I had this nagging question for many years, and finally one semester I discussed this with my bilingual brain class I was teaching. This is the class. And I was discussing this issue of etymology, and I kind of thought, okay, let me just throw this out and see if the class would be willing to actually do the etymology of all these words. And so I suggested it, and they were actually very interested, which I was surprised to hear about. And so for about 8 or 9 weeks, we essentially went through 20,000 words. So I took 20,000 words from the English Lexicon Project. I merged that with age of acquisition norms that had been collected. So people have rate when they had learned the word, monolinguals did. And so there were about 40,000 words and about 30,000 in the age of acquisition and about 20,000 that overlapped between the two of them. So in this class, we actually did the etymology, and you have, I mean, we could do it with the program, but we actually did it by hand and checked all 20,000 words. And what we found was actually, in a way, maybe not surprising now, given the sort of setup that I did here, which is, so in blue, what we have here is the age of acquisition. So how people, monolinguals, rate or native English speakers that report speaking no other language fluently. They rate when they've learned this word, so the age at which they learn the word. It actually goes all the way up to 18, so it's kind of truncated here for display purposes. You'll see in a second why I did that. This is the frequency of the word, so how frequent, the log of the frequency, how frequent the word is used. And what you see is that words that are highly frequent, so used a lot by adult frequency, that are learned early in life, are mostly blue. Blue is Germanic, Anglo-Saxon in origin. Words like hand, like apple, a lot of body parts, hair, foot, etc. Are, and also interestingly, farm animals, sheep, cow, not zoo animals, which is kind of interesting, but farm animals tend to be Germanic. And then as time goes on, there's actually this humongous wave that you can start to see kind of going. So it's not as if there aren't any new words being learned that are Germanic of origin, but what you have is this huge wave of Latin words that kind of jumps in, right? That's the whole point of this sort of bidialectal, at least at the vocabulary level, roughly, that there are these two different sources of words that are coming in at different points in time in English. And to contrast that more recently, so in this this paper that was published, we took some crowdsourcing data, and we looked at the difference between monolinguals, right? In their accuracy. So let me just explain here, right? So the -1 is an Anglo-Saxon word, right? Like hand, and 1 would be something like a Latin word. So something like elephant. Try that one. I know they're not matched on length, but you get the idea. And what you find is that monolingual English speakers are more accurate at Germanic words than they are at Latin words, Latin-based words. For L2 English speakers, and unfortunately in their crowdsourcing study, they didn't say what the origin of it is, but apparently according to the authors, many of them are Spanish speakers. So that might bias these results, but we don't know actually what their L1 is, their first language. What you see for them is that their accuracy is lower, right? So non-native speakers have lower accuracy in a lexical decision task, deciding if this is a word or not. And in fact, they're better at the Latin-based words than they are at Germanic words. So they're learning English as older, right, adolescents or adults. They're learning it through Latin, whereas the native speakers seem to be more biased towards Germanic words. We found a similar pattern for reaction times as well, somewhat similar, but again, interestingly, right, big effects of faster for Germanic words than Latinates, much smaller effects for non-natives, although interestingly, in a similar kind of direction. So again, right, this suggests that how L2 learners learn English and how monolinguals learn English is different. So then the question is, well, what is German, right? If we're going to talk about a Germanic language, so German is a Germanic language. so there were some limitations. So we did in a subsequent analysis, we did a similar type of a sort of etymology rating, and what you see is something similar to English, which is surprising, right? Which is that you have this sort of Anglo-Saxon early wave, right? Frequent words that are in German are of German origin, like it is in English, but you also have this Latinate wave. The only limitation I would add is this is 3,000 words versus 20,000 words. And so I wonder to what extent we're getting as much of a representation of words as we are in English. So this is an interesting question for Germans, right? Because in a way they're learning, are they also learning this Latinate kind of wave coming in? And apparently, according to a colleague I have, a Hungarian colleague, Latin appears in Western European languages like Hungarian, where Latinates come in to represent, advanced concepts. Now, the most boring one I'll show you today is Spanish, right? So basically, if you're going to learn Spanish, it was called Vulgar Latin, right? Those were all the Latin-derived languages that are Romance languages. There are some Arabic words. There are a few words that are sprinkled in here and there even from German and from other sources, but the vast majority of words that are learned in Spanish are Latin-derived words. So that in a way, that's kind of a boring story compared to German and English. And so the interesting thing about this is, so in a paper published by Hartshorn in 2018, he looked at, so this was a grammatical test done with 660 or 600,000 people, now expanded to 1 million and even larger. It was a mass study. And in that study, the question was a question about critical periods, but in the back of that paper, there's an analysis about what's the best age to learn English as a foreign language, right? And this was roughly a grammatical usage kind of test. It wasn't a vocabulary test. And what you can see is that the best age to learn, right, a second language depends on, or learn English as a second language or as a foreign language depends on what language a person's coming from. So in this particular study, if people were if they were Romance language speakers, the best time to learn it, according to their data, was at 0 simultaneously. If they were West Germanic, speakers of a West Germanic language, so Dutch, German, of course, then the best time was between 1 and 5. And if they were speaking Mandarin, Chinese, the best time was between 6 and 10. Now, there's a caveat. Hartshorn himself, I've asked him about this. He says, we have a limitation with our power, because he had 600,000 subjects to test his critical period questions, and not so many to test these sort of particular language transfer kinds of questions. But still, he has a lot of data, and it's very interesting that Romance and West Germanic, that the window is longer for West Germanic from 1 to 5, later for Mandarin Chinese, and then much earlier for Romance, right? Apparently simultaneous is the best. And this is just the same data that I showed you, but again, sort of emphasizing how the Romance language, the best outcome is simultaneous acquisition of English as a foreign language. West Germanic, it's a longer window. And if you look at the data, it's interesting to see it looks quite similar between English and German, right? So it's almost like a natural second language for German speakers. And the Economist has published articles stating that, in fact, the best speakers, the country with the best speakers of English as a foreign language or second language is Germany. This is some other data from Julia Kovelman's lab. Son, one of the students working with her, looked at Spanish English and Chinese English bilingual children reading words in English relative to monolinguals. And I just circled 3 little dots here because I thought it was interesting that for Spanish English bilingual children reading in English, their phonological awareness really matters. And if we think about this, they haven't really published this in terms of thinking about what types of words they're reading, but it wouldn't be surprising that someone who spoke Spanish and then read in English would notice that some of these words are similar, right? For Chinese English bilinguals, it was actually vocabulary that was really driving it, although phonological awareness and morphological awareness matter. So the endings matter for reading. Is it an ing? Is it ion, et cetera? And for English monolinguals, what you find is, again, an emphasis on phonological awareness and morphological awareness, but not so much on vocabulary. So again, the differential weighting, and just, you know, this is all hearsay, but and asking some of the, I have a few students from China, and I asked them, you know, what do you think about the difference between these Latinates and these Germanic words? Because, you know, they're in the middle of this, they've gotten caught up in this whole etymology project that we're doing. And they say, you know, we just memorize them. They're just words for us. There's not really any kind of difference. They just mean different things. So that's interesting. Now you might wonder, well, is this really just a vocabulary phenomenon, right? So I ran across this from an investment person that I read. He's someone from Russia who moved to the US, and then became part of an investment firm, and he writes a lot of books. And so he wrote this in one of his blogs. 2 weeks after we arrived back to Denver, the world changed, right? So on and so forth. This was COVID-19, right? And so the question would be then, so does etymology kind of drive grammaticality, right? So the examples I like to come up with is like something like Domino's gave me the pizza is correct, right? Domino's gave the pizza to me, that sounds fine. A little bit odd, right? But it works. But you can't say Domino's delivered me the pizza, right? You have to say Domino's delivered the pizza to me. And that's because delivered is a Latinate, right? And so therefore, this gave me the pizza is sort of a Germanic kind of form, right? Where you take what they call the dative and you stick it in the middle. And so notice that the more Latinate form, right? You couldn't do this in Spanish. I mean, you can, but it's not grammatically correct. But again, notice that gave the pizza to me is more the Latinate, so the Latin form of how you would say it. You would literally say, Domino's me dio la pizza, or me dio la pizza a mí, so it really exaggerated. So you would say a mí, to me, right? But you don't, again, right? Notice that it depends on what the origin of that verb is, what is grammatical and what's not. So I do feel that there's there's some changes in grammar that occur depending on the etymology of the verb. And then I just want to kind of end when we think about Conrad, right? And why was his writing so elegant? So what I did in this particular version of the same paragraph I began with, which was the day was ending in a serenity, right? Serenity is Latin, of still and exquisite brilliance, Latin again. The water shone pacifically. The sky without a speck was a benign immensity. So notice what he's doing is he's essentially writing this sort of Germanic, if you will, more basic English and peppering it in with these very nice Latin words, right? And so it makes it very elegant without making it unreadable. If you really want to make it unreadable, then you can do what I did to this version, which I took his text and actually made it really Latin. In this case, it would be something like the diurnal completion was embedded in a silent serenity and exquisite brilliance. The aqueous fluorescence floated pacifically, the atmosphere vacant of, anyway, you get the idea, right? When you read this thing, it becomes like a biology text, right? It doesn't, the very ending, which is the approach of the sun, becomes the ascension of the solar mass. It sounds like I'm reading something in astronomy or, I don't know. It just doesn't sound like literature anymore. So the questions that I kind of have, and I kind of stumbled on this indirectly in some ways, is, should we code etymology in our models of lexical access, right? Does etymology add anything beyond traditional measures such as length, word frequency, age of acquisition? Is it a combination of those different types of factors? And what about corpus analyses? We've been using these age of acquisition, norms, looking at people that are pretty good in terms of, people are pretty good at knowing that I learned the word hand before I learned the word abacus, right? And I can guess pretty well about what age I learned it, and people are actually surprisingly pretty accurate at doing that as adults. And then we have some societal implications, right? I mean, what should the role be of Latin in teaching academic English? Should it be done directly? There's a preschool I know of that I heard of, at least in the Washington, D.C. area, that's actually teaching Latin in preschool. Should it be done indirectly via Romance languages? Should English be taught as a second language in general, right? Because you have this sort of Germanic base and this Latin wave that comes in. One of the questions that I sort of think about is, at what point should Latin be introduced? Should it be introduced earlier than it is, explicitly or implicitly, right, indirectly? And then if English is going to be the second language, right, what should be the first language of instruction? Should it be Germanic? Should it be Latin-based? Should it be both? There's sort of these societal questions about, what the role of Latin is an expository language, and the importance of learning that for academic readiness and college readiness. So those are more societal implications, kind of outside of my wheelhouse, but questions to think about. And then I just want to thank everybody that helped out with all this research, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We can take questions. I'm not seeing anything online just yet, but if there's anything in the room.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic talk. I had two questions. You were looking at both at the direction or the best time to learn those new languages. And I was wondering if you've looked at the best order in which to learn languages. So if you're going to be learning, let's say, all three of them, if you've studied which three and in what order would be the most effective. And then the other thing I was wondering was, when you say that it's, the best time to learn English as a foreign language is between the ages of 6 and 10, is that actually based on age, or is that based on language proficiency? And would you be able to say the same thing as like you're learning Chinese and you've reached the level of mastery that is ages 6 to 10, but say you're 40, would that then also be the best time to start learning English as, say, a third language? Yeah, basically, I'm just wondering, is it about language proficiency or is it about age? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the 6 to 10 question is actually for Mandarin Chinese, right? So the finding was for Romance language speakers. So this is Hartshorn's data in his own publication. Essentially, what he did is they did a bunch of data so they could actually look at people at different ages who had learned English before that time at different ages. So they had like 22-year-olds who had learned at 10, 35-year-olds who had learned at 18. So you could see that they were trying to get this critical period question. Out of all that analysis came this sort of optimal period to learn English, to have the best proficiency in English as an adult, right? And so again, I'm not skeptical, but it's a limited analysis, but based on the analysis, right, there seem to be different points at which it's optimal to learn English as a second language. So again, I would focus on one is optimal. And of course, is it an age thing or a proficiency thing? And then of course, the question is it an individual difference thing as well? So, but all things being equal, if you speak German as a first language, you have the best and longest window for learning English as a second language, right? So I think I answered your second question. I'm trying to remember your first question. I don't know if you want to repeat it, but sorry, because I got caught up in the second one. I was trying to clarify that one.
Yeah, the first question was about the order in which the most effective order for learning languages. So because you're looking at, if you're a monolingual speaker or a native speaker of German or Chinese or English, which direction is, or what's going to be the easiest, the best optimal time to learn a new language. I was wondering if you looked at the best order in which to learn new languages. So if it's most effective to go, English, Spanish, Chinese, or if learning Chinese first is most effective and then going Spanish, English. I don't know if you have done that kind of research, but I was just wondering.
Yeah, I haven't done the research, but that's a really good question. I guess the answer is, what's the outcome that you want? So if you want the outcome to have no accent in English, then Joseph Conrad's not the optimal way to go. He had a very, very bad accent, but he wrote really well, right? So, I mean, it depends on what your outcome is. If your outcome, your measuring stick is, do you speak unaccented, right? Relatively, we know they're regional accents, but they would say that you're a native English speaker, whatever that means. There's a broad range of that, but let's just use that term. So then the question is, what order? The answer would be, it depends on what your outcome you want. If you want high-level academic English, then my inkling is that the earlier you learn Latin, the better. What order and when, that's sort of an empirical question. We don't really know what the best order for acquisition of English. Of course, if you want to learn Japanese, then that's a whole different other route. If you want to learn Arabic, in fact, it turns out written Arabic is not spoken by anyone. As far as I know, it's only a written language. So that's like a whole other can of worms of diglossia between spoken and written Arabic. So it all depends on what direction you're going in and what outcome you want. But I would say if you want to have a high level of academic English, then you need to learn Latin at a relatively young age. And the younger, I would argue, would be the better. But that again, that's just my hunch. We haven't actually tested that directly. There is some data that suggests that that's true.
Cool. Thank you.
Very good question.
Not seeing any questions online or anyone else at the microphone in person. So thank you, Arturo, for your data and presentation today. And thank you to all our speakers again in the Cognitive Science Society for making space for our Spark Society members to present their research. So I hope everyone has a great rest of their conference. Thank you.